My guests today are Greg Koval, the Assistant Deputy Commandant for Resources at the Marine Corps, and Joe Nave, a Principal of the Federal Finance Transformation Lead for KPMG. Greg, Joe, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
Today we're talking about, in some ways, this is a little bit of a celebration. Back in February, the Marine Corps finished a 2-year pilot to get an unmodified audit opinion. Now, what does that mean? People are going to ask. Well, for their 2023 financial statements, it presents a true and fair reflection of the Marine Corps' financial information, and that's about $46 billion in total assets. Now, as Greg will tell us during our discussion, it's not 100% good to go. You're not perfect. 7 improvements are still needed, and we'll go through that too. But really what this does mean is this 2-year audit pilot really shows that the Marine Corps has stabilized its accounting system, inventory assets, and really understands where the money is going and has been going. So with that little bit of context in place, let me turn to Greg. Greg, what does this mean, an unqualified audit opinion? I mean, this is, hopefully you guys celebrated, you had some cake, because I know this has been a long journey.
Yes, we have. And look, this was a historic feat. A lot of us who are in the financial community, we know CFO Act was passed in 1990. The DoD had kind of been lagging in being able to get many of the components over the finish line. And for us as a smaller service with a smaller footprint, we were able to really pull this off with some significant help, not just from our own leadership and the Commandant driving this, but also leadership across DoD stepping in to help us out and get us over the finish line. With regards to what it means for us, look, it took a village to help us get there. And going forward now, we will be able to go forth to Congress, to the taxpayers, and demonstrate that we're accountable for the funds that they provide to us, and we're accountable for the assets they provide to us, no matter where they are around the world. So, we'll probably hit on this a little bit more later, but this was really a global approach. There were global aspects to it, and those $46 billion in assets are deployed in many places around the world as we sit here.
In many ways, this idea of an unqualified audit opinion, it means not just that you can fully account for those assets, but you really understand the obligations, the money in, money out. I mean, this has a bigger issue than I think the most important one, obviously, is the accountability of taxpayer funds and assets. But this is bigger for the Marine Corps because you also know then what the financial situation is, and then how that you can kind of direct money, move money, push money to the right areas. Talk a little bit about, from a mission perspective, what this means as well.
So from a mission perspective, it gives us transparencies into the cost of production, and in the future, also tracking the cost of maintenance for many of our weapon system platforms. So what it does over time is allow us to really plan, program, budget, execute better, identify those programs where maybe they cost a little bit more, a little bit less, get those funds to the right place more timely so that we're better able to execute and give the warfighter what they need to execute the mission. Because ultimately, on the financial side, we're here to support them, help them, give them everything they need. So when they deploy, they've got the best solution, best weapon system they can have at that point in time.
Joe from KPMG, let me bring you into the conversation. This is a huge lift for any organization, the Marine Corps especially. From your perspective and where you all fit into this in terms of helping the Marine Corps meet their goals, what was the big challenge here? Why was this such an important accomplishment?
Yeah, thank you, Jason. I think from our perspective, the big challenge was just the mountain of data that you had to sift through, the business processes across the board for a geographically dispersed organizations such as the Marine Corps. You look at all of the integration across the rest of the DoD and different partners outside of the spectrum that the Marine Corps has operational control over, and you start to look at how complex and complicated those processes can really be. So from our perspective, it was helping them analyze, assess risk, boil down a couple, not boil the ocean, but get the activities that we really needed to accomplish down to a finite list where we could really focus our efforts and help them move some of these big rocks associated with the material weaknesses and audit deficiencies. I think over time, you look at the way that the workforce is structured and having to do, 100% of a day job, and then you add in some of these audit priorities and you add in some of the samples. We've really had to look at ways to modernize and automate those processes to help facilitate quicker reviews, quicker QCs, and make sure that we're set up for success and able to respond efficiently and effectively to the audit. So from a KPMG perspective, we've sat on both sides of the fence as an auditor and as a consultant. So we've got a little bit of a look back into what those requirements are. And I really think we were able to bring a lot of that to bear for the Marine Corps. Certainly a lot of work left to be done when you look at the material weaknesses and some of the things that we're focusing on for FY25 and beyond. But I do think that the Marine Corps is set up for long-term sustainment with some of the process and procedural changes they've made for audit response overall.
I'm glad, Joe, you brought up the processes and procedure changes, because I think that is really what's going on here. I mean, following the money is always good, but if your systems and your processes and all the data that you talked about are not in place, none of this can happen. So let's start there. Talk about that process changes that had to be made. Maybe Greg, lead us off. What went into achieving this goal? I know there's a lot, so you can't go through everything, but give me a sense of what were some of the big rocks that, as Joe mentioned, you had to move.
So, and I think starting with the beginning, there were a lot of subplots, as we would call it. And one of them was our migration to the Defense Agencies Initiative, or DAI. And I think one of the things that was maybe forgotten in the celebration of the audit opinion is that at the beginning of this journey, we moved to a new general ledger. So we had what we called Sabres. It was known and loved across the Marine Corps for almost 3 decades, maybe a little over 3 decades. And we took everybody off of that accounting system and moved into this new modern ERP, which had its set of challenges. We basically adopted a system that smaller DoD components used. And some of our business processes were new to the system, new to the process. There was a huge learning curve there. And that learning curve didn't just impact the financial folks, it impacted supply and procurement. There were times where we were working hard to pay vendors on time because the system wasn't working as our old system did. But I think it really brought some additional discipline and internal controls to the financial processes that ultimately helped us understand some of our procurement and logistic processes a little bit better. It really kind of opened our aperture on some of the costs that we were incurring, who we were paying, and it gave us that additional transparency and visibility into the data. So, I think we don't want that to be lost on everybody, because that was really a titanic shift in the way that we did business. And we did that at the beginning of this 2-year audit journey. So there's a lot of agility, a lot of quick learning. A lot of folks had to do a lot of things differently that they had been doing the same way for decades.
Joe, the thing that Greg brings up with this idea of the learning curve, as you've worked with other clients, public sector, private sector, and the like, what has to change? It's a culture change. We know that it's always the culture change. We've been hearing that for years. But from your perspective, what has to change to kind of get the get toward a clean audit? Is it just the understanding of the end goal? Is it the pieces and parts that come together? Walk me through a little bit about what you see as some of those big things that tend to have to be addressed.
Sure, Jason. Thank you. And I did want to emphasize to Greg's point, migrating to a new accounting system at the beginning of this 2-year journey was certainly an undertaking. And it brings me to your question, which is adaptability. And it's something that I think that the Marine Corps did exceedingly well in this journey. They were going through process changes. They were going through a new system. End users down at the tactical level and out at the fleet are now transacting in something that they weren't used to a month ago. And all the while we're undergoing this high pressure environment of a 2-year audit cycle. So I think, when you look at whether it's private or federal industries, it's about adaptability, knowing that the plan is the plan, and it's usually never going to survive first contact. So one is being adaptable and making sure that there's good, effective communication across all parties that are involved to make sure that a new plan can be put in place. We can adapt to change, and then we can move on with addressing some of the big rocks. And then that brings me to the next point of, you really need to boil your problem set down to achievable milestones and goals. I think that a lot of times we look at the end state of an unmodified opinion, but from starting point to end and then through sustainment, there's a lot of things that we can put into discrete buckets and measure our progress against. I've never been a big fan of POAMs. I like dashboarding, and I like data, and I like to make sure that our clients have the insight that they need to see real time where progress is being made and where progress is being made against those discrete buckets I mentioned. And then usually we like to assess tiger teams against that. And it's these small, mobile, when I think about the terms of that would resonate in this environment, it's those mobile kind of tactical units that are going out and solving these problems with brute force, and then focusing on the sustainment of that. And that really gets us to our end goal of a modified opinion, and being able to continue that modified opinion year in and year out, layering in that automation and modernization to those tiger team efforts. But the big takeaway here, Jason, is going to be that adaptability, and being comfortable being uncomfortable, and knowing that there are going to be hurdles in the way. There are going to be things that you can't control that you're going to have to manage through, certain risks that are presented to you as you go through this cycle that you have no control over, that as an organization you're going to have to monitor and have a good governance process over. So those are probably the highlights and main points I'd say will get you there, and what you need to focus on for the future.
And just to add to what Joe said, really in terms of culture change. So the culture of the Marine Corps has always been to be accountable to yourselves, your comrades, your units. And that was taken to a very low level. But when you have to do financial reporting for, as you mentioned, Jason, up front, $46 billion in assets, all of that information needs to roll up. And I think in a lot of cases, the sharing, the comfort with pushing that data upward made, folks uncomfortable in some cases, because now you're opening up visibility of potentially audit exceptions and mistakes to some very senior leaders who are watching the audit. And that culture of, it's okay, this is accounting, we can make adjustments, that needed to really resonate through the organization.
Yeah, I to Greg's point, that quarterly financial reporting process is something that was refined quarter over quarter, year over year. And, when you're talking about Marines and the civilians, it's a zero-sum game, right? They want perfection. And I think it is getting used to that idea that from a financial reporting standpoint, it's not always about perfection. Now, when we start talking about accountability of assets and we start talking about some of the things at the tactical level that really drives kind of the ethos of Marines and civilians out there in the fleet, that's the basic building block. And that's what really supported our financial reporting, was them having their arms around those processes and procedures, us being able to press a button, us being able to consolidate and summarize reports out there from the myriad of stakeholders, whether it be in-house with the Marine Corps, or if it's external agencies that are holding assets on our behalf. That process really was finessed over the years, and I think that's something that really helped push us over the audit hump, was once we were able to get comfort with pushing those reports upstream and getting the feedback from the auditors on what we needed to do or what we needed to clear up to help push us through the audit cycle.
Joe, I love the fact you talked about, I'm not a big fan of poems. I'm not sure anyone is a big fan of poems, but the data and the dashboards definitely are good to drive the change. Gentlemen, let's take a quick break. We come back, we will continue our conversation. My guests today are Greg Koval, the Assistant Deputy Commandant for Resources for the Marine Corps, and Joe Nave, a Principal and Federal Finance Transformation Lead for KPMG. I'm Jason Miller, and you're listening to the discussion Marine Corps Milestone, Unqualified Audit Insight, sponsored by KPMG on Federal News Network. Welcome back. You're listening to the discussion Marine Corps Milestone, Unqualified Audit Insight, sponsored by KPMG on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today are Greg Koval, the Assistant Deputy Commandant for Resources for the Marine Corps, and Joe Nave, Principal and Federal Financial Transformation Lead for KPMG. Gentlemen, before break, we were talking a little bit about that culture change. That's always the most difficult thing when we talk about any sort of modernization effort, technology, financial management, HR, so on and so forth. I want to go back to Greg and say something. How did you push this change management effort through? What were some of those things you did to say, hey, we realize this is uncomfortable. Hey, we realize this is hard, but for us to meet this goal and really to be better as a whole organization, we need to get there. How'd you kind of work that effort?
Thanks, Jason. And that's a great question. You know, what I like to say is we operate a lot of times in what we call silos of excellence. And we have procurement, we have budget, we have supply and logistics, we have asset management, we have accounting, we have dispersing. There's all these business processes across the department and organizations that were built up to support the business. But what we found through the audit was all of these organizations need to work together better. They need to share data. The systems that aren't connected to each other actually need to talk to each other. And when you look at the material weaknesses that we received, especially on the property side, this is really where we have to take data from system A, system B, and system C, mash it all together in a spreadsheet and come up with a financial report. And what the audit did for us was really bring those organizations closer together. It broke down a lot of the walls in communication and in the way that we work with each other. And now supply, logistics, procurement, accounting, we all have a better understanding of what we do, how we impact each other, and what needs to change to make the organization more efficient and effective and save costs, frankly, going forward. Because, working in that environment in silos makes everybody's job harder, even though everybody's accomplishing their mission that they're given. So that's really something that we're going to look to in the future, and continue to build upon that and really integrate our processes and systems more, not just to pass audit, but just to make ourselves a more efficient organization.
It seems so easy, right? Like, oh, we should work together, but folks, you kind of put your head down, you're just in your own little world, and getting that sharing can be difficult. Joe, is this a common challenge that a lot of organizations, as they kind of move toward that clean audit, find themselves in, where they have to kind of break down those walls and to go back to what Greg said, those silos of excellence have to come together?
Yeah, I do think this is common across any organization, whether it's a government entity or it's private. You've got pockets of excellence. You've got individuals and organizations focusing on their specific piece of the mission. You layer in the complexity of audit for an organization getting to auditability, and you're going to have, conflicts or frictions going to arise. There are going to be competing priorities. There are going to be things that one organization's focused on more than the other. So I think that getting to a common place and understanding and looking at it from an overarching entity perspective, here is the goal that we need to accomplish from an audit standpoint that's going to help improve mission, that's going to help improve our operations, that's going to help us get better visibility across our execution. I think that's a good message to send, and that's what the Marine Corps has done well. Specifically looking at even outside of the Marine Corps, you've got a number of organizations that are critical to the success, breaking down those silos as well, making sure that we're partnering well with the Army and the Navy, whether it's going to a depot to inspect ammo or it's working on integration activities with the Navy. It's something that we've got to continue to do and do well. I think that as the Marine Corps and these organizations continue that partnership and continue to support one another, it's going to make the audit a lot less burdensome for everyone. So I do think that looking at those legacy systems, looking at those legacy ways of communicating across those silos, breaking down those barriers, looking at how we interface with one another, I think that that's certainly going to help improve, and not only improve, but sustain this audit piece. And I want to take it back to that piece on making it less burdensome. I think when we've got the communication lines clearly laid out to where we know who's doing what and when we need what from certain people, it makes it a lot easier to get the audit piece done.
Joe talks about the idea of reducing complexity of audit, dealing with friction, and that's a great segue to Greg. It's an accomplishment. Great, you've done it. Now, how do you keep it going? You talk about there's some material weaknesses. What are your plans to continue to move this forward to address those material weaknesses?
Yes, that's a great question. So, yeah, first and foremost, it's looking at the data, the system environment, and implementing better internal controls over our processes and being able to demonstrate the controls are in place. Because what we found is a lot of times folks are doing what they need to do across the Marine Corps, but where we fall short is the evidence. So if you did an inventory 2 weeks ago of all the assets for your unit, did you document it? Did you identify what you found or didn't find? And then did you have your supervisor sign and date it? Something that simple could actually go a very long way to have something we could rely on for audit, and we could reduce the testing and do all of that. And again, that's a very kind of high level internal control. But it's really taking some of those fundamental steps in many areas, and then being able to, at the enterprise level, track what's happening all the way down to the unit level and be able to report upon that. What I want to go back to, though, is really the system and the data piece. We cannot continue to operate in an environment where our key business systems are not connected and seamlessly talking to each other. We have too many things moving around the world at any given time to be able to press the stop button, download everything, do some really amazing spreadsheet machinations, give that to the auditors, let them go out and test, and then come back with an unqualified or an unmodified opinion. That's not the way we want to continue to do business in the future. We also need to look at our IT. And again, this kind of gets back to some basic blocking and tackling. If you make a change to a system, document that change, maintain the information that demonstrates you documented the change, assessed the change, implemented the change, and here are the results. Our interfaces, we have a little bit less control over that because there are a lot of other DoD and other Department of the Navy systems that we use. We need to continue to break down those silos and work with those interface partners to ensure the data sets we're getting are complete and accurate and timely. So a lot of work that needs to be done there. But again, you know, sometimes crossing the finish line proves you can do it. We proved we can do it. Now we just need to continue to do some more laps to get a little bit faster and a little bit better.
I guess they say the last mile of the marathon is always the most difficult one, and I'm not sure, Greg, if you guys are in the last mile yet, but you're getting close to that finish line, and I know that that's the hard work. Joe, what's your advice to other organizations, DoD or others, that maybe are also going down this path to reach a unqualified opinion? What would you say is the one or two things that you all have learned and from not just the Marine Corps experience, but from your experiences overall?
Yeah, I would say in particular, it's that adaptability piece and being comfortable with the plan and understanding that plans will change over time. I think two is the piece that Greg brought up. You know, we really want systems working for us, not against us, right? We want to make sure that our IT environment's squared away. We want to make sure that all of the interfaces or feeder systems that we have that clearly laid out, and we've looked at the complexity of those different processes and made sure that those all make sense. So really just a rationalization of your portfolio and trying to make the sandbox smaller. First, make sure everything's in the sandbox, and then what can you do to make it smaller? And then I think too, it's always going to be that leadership, that tone from the top, cascading that information down, and emphasizing the importance of, you know, whether it's audit or any other objective you're trying to accomplish, having that buy-in and tone from the top has been critical. So I think that those are the three things that I would probably pass along to any organization trying to get to auditability and sustain it.
I think excellent advice. A lot of good lessons we talked about today, but unfortunately, gentlemen, we are out of time for today. So let me thank my guests. Greg Koval is the Assistant Deputy Commandant for Resources for the Marine Corps. Greg, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. This is a great conversation.
And Joe Nave is the Principal of Federal Financial Transformation Lead for KPMG. Joe, thank you as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and glad to be here.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the discussion Marine Corps Milestone Unqualified Audit Insight, sponsored by KPMG on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search KPMG.
For every generation, it has started with the call to serve. Discovering purpose and belonging well-earned. Fighting and winning for our nation and its people. But Marines are never really finished serving. Their commitment is visible in communities across our country. This is Semper Fidelis, always faithful, always Marine.